American military leaders formally complained that the British SAS had cheated. Their crime? Wearing civilian clothes and winning. That complaint, petty, defensive, and thoroughly revealing, tells you more about the Pentagon's institutional psychology than any classified memo ever could. Because when British Special Forces operators repeatedly walked into American bases in Afghanistan, breached classified facilities, crashed planning conferences, and triggered base-wide alerts that scrambled helicopter gunships, the response from the world's most expensive military wasn't gratitude. It wasn't a security review. It was to classify their own allies as threats and accuse them of breaking the rules. The infiltrations are a good story. The reaction is a better one. To understand how we got here, you need to picture the world the United States built across Afghanistan after September 11th. Facilities like Bagram Airfield grew from austere forward positions into small cities ringed by concentric blast walls, razor wire, and vehicle checkpoints designed as kill zones. Biometric scanners catalogued the irises and fingerprints of every Afghan national who entered. Motion sensor arrays blanketed the perimeter, feeding data to operations centers staffed around the clock. Quick reaction forces sat in ready rooms beside fueled and armed helicopter gunships, waiting for alarms that would put them airborne in minutes. Congress categorized roughly $29 billion under enhanced base security across post-9/11 theaters. Every dollar was meant to reinforce a single doctrinal conviction. The perimeter was sovereign. The systems worked, and nothing that mattered could get through. Into this fortress mentality walked the men of 22 SAS Regiment. The regiment had been in Afghanistan almost from the opening days of the war, working alongside American special operations in the hunt for Al-Qaeda and Taliban leadership. Publicly, the alliance was seamless. Joint raids, shared intelligence, common purpose. Privately, a philosophical gulf shaped daily life on the ground. American force protection doctrine was heavy, procedural, and technology-dependent. A reflection of a military culture that believed you could engineer solutions to human problems. The British approach, forged through decades of colonial small wars and counterinsurgency campaigns, leaned on human intelligence, individual initiative, and the ability to improvise under pressure. SAS selection was designed to produce soldiers capable of operating alone behind enemy lines for weeks, blending into hostile populations and making decisions without waiting for a headquarters hundreds of miles away. Their tradition of operating in civilian clothes stretched back to the regiment's founding in the North African desert in 1941 and had been sharpened through covert campaigns in Malaya, Borneo, Oman, Northern Ireland and the Balkans. So when the SAS looked at American base security and saw a system that had never been stress-tested by anyone who actually knew what they were doing, they did what the regiment has done for 6 decades. They tried to break it, and they broke it immediately. According to documented accounts, SAS operators began penetrating American bases without detection, walking through security cordons and entering classified areas as though they had every right to be there. The methods were strikingly low-tech. No forged documents, no hacked systems, no prosthetics or fake uniforms. The operators wore civilian clothes, the same nondescript local garments they used every time they stepped outside the wire. And they walked in through the front. American guards, confronted with someone moving confidently through a secure area, defaulted to the assumption that this person must have been cleared by somebody else, at some other checkpoint, through some other process. Shift changes created windows of inattention. Handoff zones between units produced pockets where responsibility belonged to everyone, and therefore to no one. The places where technology ended and human judgment began were precisely the places where human judgment failed. But the deepest vulnerability wasn't procedural. An organization that had spent billions reinforcing its own security infrastructure had developed an institutional faith in that infrastructure so complete that it could no longer imagine the infrastructure might be inadequate. The SAS walked through the gap between belief and reality, and they didn't stop at the perimeter. Operators entered classified planning conferences, gatherings where upcoming mission details were being discussed among American officers who assumed everyone in the room had been vetted, and sat down without a single challenge. They moved through facilities where sensitive intelligence was stored and processed, passing through layer after layer of the architecture that existed specifically to prevent unauthorized access. At every layer, the same failure repeated. A system designed to stop enemies had no mechanism for recognizing that the people testing it were allies performing an invaluable service. When American security personnel finally realized unauthorized individuals had been moving through their facilities, they demanded answers. How did you get in? The British response, delivered with what was described as infuriating politeness, was simply that they'd walked in. No swagger, no victory lap, just the understated register that is the SAS's native tongue. The same tone a man might use to explain that he'd taken the stairs because the lift was out. Being told, with the calm of someone returning a borrowed book, that the most expensive security apparatus in military history had been undone by a change of clothes and a purposeful stride was a different category of humiliation entirely. Being breached by operators using sophisticated tradecraft at least leaves room for consolation. Being breached by men who dressed like locals and strolled through the gate does not. The institutional response arrived swiftly, and it pointed in exactly the wrong direction. A productive reaction would have been senior officers summoning their security chiefs, demanding to understand how the breaches occurred, and launching a comprehensive review of every checkpoint, every procedure, and every guard rotation that had failed. The actual reaction was fury, described by those present as something that transcended normal military frustration. The anger carried a specific institutional flavour, defensive, self-righteous, and directed outward rather than inward. The SAS had committed what amounted to an unforgivable act within American military bureaucracy. They'd produced evidence of institutional incompetence that could neither be classified away nor explained as someone else's fault. New security measures materialized with impressive speed, directed entirely at the wrong target. Access protocols tightened across multiple facilities. Additional checkpoints appeared at previously unguarded junctions. Guards received briefings warning them to watch for unauthorized personnel. Identification requirements were enhanced, cross-referenced, and layered. The system did what systems always do when threatened. It generated more of itself, more procedure, more technology, more paper, more checkpoints. More signatures on more forms. The British adapted to each new measure with what seemed like effortless ease. New checkpoints were studied for their patterns and bypassed during the gaps. Enhanced identification requirements were rendered irrelevant by operators who simply avoided the points where identification was checked. Additional guards were noted, their patrol routes memorized, their blind spots mapped. Each American escalation was met with a British adaptation so smooth that it made the escalation look not just futile, but actively foolish. An expensive, labour-intensive way of demonstrating the same vulnerability all over again. One incident compressed the entire dysfunctional dynamic into a single afternoon. An SAS operator needed specific intelligence for a mission launching in 6 hours. The information existed. The Americans held it. The formal process for requesting access, the approved, properly filed, regulation-compliant bureaucratic channel, would take 72 hours to process. 6 hours until launch. 72 hours until paperwork. The operator did what any SAS soldier trained to treat initiative as the cardinal virtue would do. He accessed the facility where the intelligence was held, copied what he needed, and walked back out. The mission launched on time with the intelligence it required. Somewhere in the system, the original request presumably continued its 72-hour journey, arriving at its destination long after the operation had been executed, debriefed, and filed. It was genuinely faster to break into a classified facility than to fill out the correct forms. Darkly comic, yes, but it laid bare something damning about the gap between American administrative architecture and the tempo of the war being fought outside the wire. The bureaucracy had been designed for a world where 72 hours was reasonable. The war didn't care. 4 operators pushed the demonstration further in a separate incident that tested the outermost layer of American security awareness. Wearing Afghan clothing, they positioned themselves outside the perimeter wire in what was described as a camping exercise, a deliberate staging operation designed to determine whether base surveillance and patrol systems could detect threats assembling near the wire. This was the exact scenario that would precede a real attack. Small teams moving into position under cover, observing guard patterns, selecting breach points. Every base defense manual in every army in the world identified this kind of pre-attack reconnaissance as the critical moment for detection. 4 men in local clothing established a position near the wire without triggering a response. When the Americans eventually discovered what had happened, the fury landed on the operators. Not on the surveillance system that hadn't seen them. Not on the patrol schedule that left the area unobserved. Not on the command structure that assumed the perimeter was being monitored when it plainly wasn't. Then came the incident that should have ended all arguments about whether the infiltrations mattered. One penetration activated base-wide motion sensors, causing American alert forces to deploy in full combat readiness and scramble helicopter gunships. Camp Bastion, one of the largest military installations in Afghanistan, home to thousands of coalition personnel, hundreds of aircraft, equipment worth hundreds of millions of dollars, went to full lockdown. Sirens cut through the dry Helmand air. Armed quick reaction teams spilled from ready rooms with weapons hot, scanning for the incursion their instruments told them was real. Helicopter gunships armed with Hellfire missiles and chain guns lifted off the flight line and swept the perimeter, crews searching for targets. Somewhere below them, a handful of British soldiers, who had just proven a catastrophic point, were navigating a situation that had crossed the line from professional exercise into mortal danger. Those operators, surrounded by armed Americans who sincerely believed they were hunting hostile infiltrators, could have been shot and killed by allies responding to what every indicator told them was a genuine enemy attack. No one should gloss over that. The aftermath crystallized the institutional response into its final absurd form. Rather than convening a joint review to analyze the vulnerabilities that had been so vividly demonstrated, American commanders moved to ensure such demonstrations could never happen again, by targeting the demonstrators. According to accounts, the response was to effectively classify British allies as potential security threats. The Special Air Service, a regiment that had fought alongside the United States in every major conflict since World War II, that was conducting joint operations against the Taliban at that very moment, that had buried its dead in the same wars, was now formally categorized by American military bureaucracy as a threat to be managed. The procedures that failed to detect the infiltrations remained largely intact. The institutional culture that produced those procedures went unexamined. According to accounts, the formal complaint centered on the operator's use of civilian clothes. That was the cheating. It's worth understanding what this accusation reveals about the complaining institution's worldview, because the word does more diagnostic work than any policy review. Wearing civilian clothes was cheating because it circumvented the one variable the security system was designed to assess: whether someone looked like they belonged. The system could process uniforms, credentials, badges. It could scan biometric data and check names against databases. What it couldn't do was identify a threat that didn't present itself in the expected packaging. The SAS had dressed like the enemy because the enemy would dress like anything that worked. The American system had been built to catch threats that announced themselves. When confronted with threats that didn't, it declared the absence of an announcement to be a violation of the rules. As a matter of sourcing integrity, the specific use of cheated comes from second-hand accounts rather than documented Pentagon language. But even framed as second-hand, the word aligns so precisely with every institutional behavior that followed, the complaints, the restrictions, the classifications, that it functions as a diagnosis whether or not it was the exact term someone used in a memo. The Camp Bastion-Camp Leatherneck complex in Helmand Province embodied the structural conditions that made all of this possible. The sprawling joint facility placed British Camp Bastion adjacent to the US Marine Corps' Camp Leatherneck. They shared a perimeter stretching miles across flat, dust-coloured terrain. They shared airspace and logistics infrastructure and, in theory, a unified security architecture. In practice, the seams between British and American zones were where vulnerabilities concentrated. One set of procedures ended and another began at boundaries that existed on organizational charts but were invisible on the ground. Guards from different nations operated under different rules of engagement, carried different identification systems, made different assumptions about who belonged where. A confident individual moving through these transitional spaces might be challenged by one nation's guards and waved through by the others, or challenged by neither because each assumed the other had already done the checking. These seams were exactly the kind of vulnerability the SAS's entire operational culture was designed to find. The regiment didn't create the gaps were always there. The SAS just proved they were real. What makes the American response so revealing isn't the anger itself. Anger is natural when someone exposes your failures. It's the direction. Every calorie of institutional energy spent classifying allies as threats, filing complaints about clothing choices, and layering new restrictions on the people who'd found the holes was a calorie not spent fixing the holes themselves. The pattern is older than Afghanistan and bigger than base security. It's what happens when an institution confuses its mythology with its capability, and then encounters evidence that the two aren't the same thing. The evidence doesn't trigger reform, it triggers an immune response. The institution attacks the evidence. The SAS, for their part, kept adapting. Each new restriction was met with the same quiet professionalism that had defined the regiment since its founding in the North African desert in 1941. They didn't argue, they didn't file counter-complaints. They just found the next gap, walked through it, and politely explained how they'd done it when asked. The understatement wasn't a strategy, it was a culture. One built on the foundational assumption that competence doesn't need to announce itself. The security weaknesses the SAS demonstrated weren't theoretical. They weren't abstract vulnerabilities that existed only in wargaming scenarios. They were real gaps in real defenses protecting real people. On September 14, 2012, 15 Taliban fighters breached the perimeter of the Camp Bastion Camp Levanek complex. They destroyed 6 AV-8B Harrier II jump jets, damaged 2 more, and killed 2 U.S. Marines, Lieutenant Colonel Christopher Rabel and Sergeant Bradley Atwell. The attackers wore American military uniforms and split into 3 teams, exploiting gaps in perimeter surveillance and the seams between different security zones. The tactics bore a grim resemblance to exactly the kind of vulnerabilities the SAS had been demonstrating for years. The most expensive military in human history had been warned by allies who risked their own lives to deliver the warning. The response was to call them cheaters and classify them as threats. The SAS were ultimately treated as a bigger problem than the actual enemies who exploited the same vulnerabilities. British allies who exposed real security failures were filed away as threats to be managed. The systemic failures they revealed remained. And the most dangerous thing the SAS ever did to American forces wasn't any single infiltration. It was proving over and over, with infuriating politeness, that they could be gotten to. Subscribe for more stories like this.